I wandered into Aunt Margot's living room the way you walk into a room you used to own, confident enough to knock over a few ghosts, but not enough to expect them to apologize. I'm Tara, and my life at the time was the sort of compressed normal you see in stationary photos. Steady job, an old pickup that smelled faintly of tire shop, a lake cottage I'd inherited and been quietly fixing up. I thought family was a parallel line that would always run near mine. Turns out they were drawing shortcuts. Aunt Margot had the TV low and the curtains half open, sunlight slashing the coffee table where an old, leather-bound photo album sat like a closed case file. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd gone over to drop off hummus and borrow a casserole dish. The album was at the center of the table, spine up, as if it wanted me to notice. Curiosity is the cheaper, louder cousin of anger. I flipped it open. There they were, a dozen glossy photos, arranged in a way that told a smug, efficient story. My brother Noah, grinning like he'd swallowed a secret, arms looped around a woman I didn't recognize at first. She looked like someone who knew how to pose for tax forms and prom photos in equal measure. Poised, practiced, the kind of smile that sits in the mouth before it reaches the eyes. Her name, on the inside cover in my aunt's careful script, was Maya. Wedding venues. Rings close enough to read the inscription on Noah's. A lakeside arch that could have been plucked from the catalog of every small-town wedding ever. My stomach did a small, efficient flip, the kind you get when a dish you thought was in the oven is cold on the counter. Maxine? I said before I remembered she answers to Margot now, which is how family stealthily shifts its rules. When did Noah get married? Aunt Margot's knitting slowed. She didn't look up right away, just slid her thumb along the edge of a photo, as if that could hide it. "Last weekend, dear," she said. "Thought you knew?" "You put the wedding last weekend?" My voice sounded like a bored judge. She set the knitting down. "We had to keep it small, and we sent the invitations with the wrong dates for a reason." You never want to hear the next sentence in a family argument. You expect bargaining, excuses, tears, maybe an emotional casserole. You do not expect intentional exclusion announced like a weather report. "For what reason?" I asked. "To keep it peaceful. You know how you make things awkward," she said, and there it was, the old soft weaponized euphemism. "I don't yell in fits. I file receipts." I remember the exact tilt of my aunt's voice, as if I'd be charged interest on the memory. "We thought you might try to stop it," she added, as casually as if she'd told me the brownies weren't gluten-free. The photos blurred into a story I hadn't been cast in. Invitations. My invitation, the one I'd held, the one addressed to me with the wrong date, had not been a mistake. It was a sluice gate closed on purpose. The whole wedding had been a weekend performance, curated by people who didn't want me in the audience. I sat down hard enough that the couch complained in a creaking, very human way. There's a split second where you can either accept the world as it is or start dismantling it. In that moment, the Lakehouse, the repairs I'd been financing because it's a family asset, the dinners I'd shown up to because that's what family does. They all rewired into something else. Tools for leverage. Lamps to be switched off. Did Noah know we were leaving him off the date? I asked. Aunt Margot looked like someone who'd eaten sour candy and decided it was dessert. He knew. He said he didn't want drama. We thought it best. Noah, my brother, my childhood co-conspirator in every petty tyranny and shared secret, had been told to keep the drama off the stage. He'd learned to smile without me in the seat. That was the real sting. Not the ceremony, but the erasure. I closed the album gently because you don't smash photographs. You let them sit there, perfect and poisonous. I left Aunt Margot's house with the casserole dish still clean, the hummus untouched in the bag, and the knowledge that the invitation with the wrong date hadn't been a bureaucratic error. It had been a decision. Someone had decided I didn't belong at my brother's wedding, and they'd chosen to make it look like a courtesy instead of the quiet exile it was. Driving home, the lake I'd been repairing flickered in the distance, blue and unbothered. The idea of family as a quiet harbor caught on driftwood. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone who'd been paying the harbor fees while everyone else decided who could sail in. I parked 2 houses down from my parents' place because the driveway is an emotional minefield, and I didn't fancy tripping any more landmines than necessary. The Harper house, Greg and Linda's, looked like the kind of suburban castle that keeps its flags lowered, manicured, polite, and very practiced at pretending nothing was happening. I wasn't going to knock. I wasn't going to stage a dramatic entrance. I told myself I'd come to talk, not to torch bridges. But I do have a talent for overhearing things when I least expect to, and the porch was the kind of liminal space where people let secrets wander out on their own. Noah was on the phone on their back steps, pacing like he was trying to rehearse sincerity into his stride. His voice dripped with the same immaculate calm he'd used in wedding photos. I stopped at the lattice and leaned close enough to hear the shape of the words. "We made sure she wasn't there to ruin everything," I heard him say, and it landed like a bus with polite upholstery. He said it like it was a fact of life, as if the clause belonged in the family bylaws. That sentence should have been enough to make me turn and leave, to walk away from a family that'd written me off so casually. But people who've paid for things quietly, houses, repairs, late-night bailouts, have a different kind of limit. It's not about pride. It's about accounting. You don't balance a ledger and then ignore the ledger's conclusions. I pushed the door open. They were all there. Linda with her practiced host smile, Greg pretending the noise was the cat, Noah with his phone still pinned to his ear. The quiet tightened like a belt. "Hi," I said. Nothing theatrical, just a word that used up all the air. "Noah," my mother said, breath hooked somewhere between alarm and performative fluster. "Tara, what a surprise." I didn't answer the surprise part. I walked to the kitchen table, where the invitations had been scattered like confetti left to be swept. One of them, mine, was folded face down. I picked it up, felt the prickle where the date had been wrong, and slid it across the laminate like a small, sharp stone. "Was this a mistake?" I asked, "or a concerted effort to keep me away?" Noah hung up. He turned as if surprised that the world had consequences. "Tara, Stop," I said. "I already heard you, Noah. On the phone. We made sure she wasn't there to ruin everything." Silence filled the kitchen with the speed of a snapped wire. My father's eyes darted not to me, but to a place where excuses could be arranged neatly on a platter. My mother's lips tightened like someone pinching a piece of conscience out of sight. "You know family dynamics," Greg finally stammered. "We were trying to keep it peaceful. There were tensions." "Tensions?" I laughed, a dry thing that tasted like motor oil. "You mean the tense ease of excluding me while expecting me to keep paying for what you call family assets?" The table shifted. Linda's face reddened in a way that tried to look like mortification, but landed more like inertia. "We could have called you." "No," I said. "You could have put your own money into the cottage instead of treating it like a line item in your personal budget. You could have paid your share." I set a slim manila envelope down and fanned out a few pages. Invoices, canceled checks, bank transfer slips with the logo of Blue Water Holdings, LLC, my holding company, tucked at the corner like a little secret I'd never needed to shout. Each number told the same story. Me, quietly stabilizing what everyone else treated as a communal prop. "And since we're doing honesty," I said, putting my palm flat on the table like the gavel it was, "let's make a different kind of record." I slid another photocopy across. It was plain, stamped by the county recorder's office, the deed to the lake cottage. At the top in black type was the legal fact: Tara Harper, sole owner. You should have seen the way those three names recomposed themselves on their faces. Noah tried to look surprised like bad acting. Greg tried to look hurt like it might somehow be a performance I could forgive. Linda opened her mouth and then closed it because she had no script left. "You put it in your name?" my mother whispered. The whisper was a thing that wanted to be scandalized, but smelled instead faintly of accusation. "Tara, why would you do that without telling us?" "Because I paid for the repairs. Because when the roof leaked, I wrote the checks. When the dock rotted, I hired the carpenters. When you told me it was family upkeep, I assumed that meant honest contributions." I assumed wrong. My voice was even. My anger was administrative. "So I made it formal, not to spite you, but to stop the quiet ledger theft." Noah's jaw worked. He said, "We relied on you. We thought—" "You thought I wanted to be the family ATM?" I asked. "Thought is not consent, Noah." The air got heavy with the smell of lemon-scented cleaner and unspent apologies. My father tried to reach across the table like someone reaching for receipts he'd let fly away. "I'm not saying we can't talk about this," I said. "I'm saying I will not continue to fund your life while you manufacture my absence for your peace of mind." They asked questions, the kind that begin with why and end in now. I answered with documents, dates, and bank transfers. It wasn't satisfying. It was precise. My revelations were not dramatic confessions. They were accounting entries with faces. When I left, I carried the weight of the deed with the ease of someone who knows what ownership actually means. I'd opened a different kind of door than the one I'd closed at Aunt Margot's living room. The family had been startled awake, and like most startled things, they were still trying to decide whether to run, deny, or arrange the feathers. I drove away not feeling triumphant. I felt tidy, like someone who's done the math and decided to stop paying the bill for other people's lies. The ledger was no longer invisible. It had a name. I learned very quickly that anger is useful, but receipts are lethal. After the kitchen table episode, I came home and did the thing people in family wars are usually too prideful to do. I made a spreadsheet. It wasn't dramatic. No red circles, no thunderclap music, just rows and columns with dates, amounts, memo lines. Blue Water Holdings, LLC, transfer to Harper Cottage, 4/6/2023, $12,400. Roofing. Little lights of paper that added up to a story. Me, underwriting a life I didn't get to be part of. Ava Moreno was the first person I called. Ava looks like she stepped out of a law school honor roll poster. Sharp blazer, glasses that suggest she reads statutes for fun. She didn't wink at my melodrama. She asked for documents. She asked for timelines. She asked for the names of everyone who knew. Lawyers are the heroes who insist on footnotes. We met in her office, which smelled faintly of coffee and inevitable motions. I gave her my spreadsheet, copies of bank transfers, canceled checks, invoices from the contractors I'd hired, and the county deed showing the cottage in my name. Ava nodded the way someone does when they're cataloging evidence, quietly delighted by the clarity of it. "You did something smart when you didn't realize you'd need to," she said. "You kept a paper trail. That makes this a lot easier." We mapped an action plan that felt both surgical and vindicated. First, separate the finances in a way that made future bleed-through impossible. Joint bank accounts would be closed. Co-signed loans, the ones they'd quietly put me on because it'll be easier if you're the one with the steady credit, would be transferred or refinanced, so I wasn't on the hook. Investment portfolios that were effectively joint for tax convenience would be split and re-registered. Beneficiaries would be reviewed. Power of attorney access would be revoked where necessary. She used words like reconveyance and assignment, and I used the one I liked. Finally. Closing the joint accounts was procedural theater. I went to the bank with my ID, a copy of the deed, and a calm that came from numbers. Tellers shuffled as if they were rearranging deck chairs, then pulled out forms. There were pleas. You could leave it as is for peace. And the inevitable suggestion that we negotiate, not sever. I insisted. I wanted clean lines. I wanted to make it clear that peace achieved by erasure was not my business model. The co-signed loans were trickier. Banks do not enjoy losing guarantors. For each loan, I either paid down enough to remove the co-signature, arranged for a refinance in my parents' names, or negotiated an assignment of responsibility. I signed paperwork that felt like mini battles. Promissory note here, release there. There was some pushback. Banks prefer a paper trail of collateral and fiscal pain. But Ava called, and when she called, the banks listened. She had a voice that treated the bank's legal department the way a conductor treats an orchestra. The chorus of what-ifs was quieted with offers to restructure terms and deadlines. Investment portfolios were, for my family, the most comfortable corner of complacency. They'd been joint accounts in practice, a family account where money moved for convenience. But they were not my sandbox to keep funding. I met with a broker, sat across a table that smelled faintly of citrus and quarterly reports, and asked each question Ava had prepped. Who is listed as owner? Who are the beneficiaries? Can these assets be split without heavy tax penalties? Do we need a trustee? The answer was a mix of practical and painful. Some assets were simple transfers, others required tax planning. I set an appointment with an accountant to schedule the split in a way that minimized collateral fallout. It wasn't charity, it was housekeeping. While the financial house cleaning was pragmatic, there was another, messier thing to address: the way they showed up at my workplace and my life. Lori, my office manager, had started getting strange calls. My father had appeared twice at the building pretending he had business at my floor. One morning, a woman claiming to be from the congregation of their church stopped by to deliver a note about family. After I tightened controls at work and told HR what had happened, Ava said the words that make some people bristle but are absolutely necessary. File for protection. We prepared an affidavit that read like a timeline of intrusions: dates, times, witnesses, copies of call logs, descriptions of who had come to the office, and the impact it had on my ability to do my job. Workplace harassment isn't always an HR memo. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of safety. Ava helped me draft a complaint and a motion for a temporary restraining order that included a request to keep my parents away from both my residence and my workplace until a hearing could be had. Filing the motion felt like closing a door with a key I'd paid for. I sat in the clerk's office, signed the papers, and watched them scan the documents like they were pressing a consecration. There's a weird mix of dread and relief in that moment. The knowledge that you're escalating the conflict, and the knowledge that escalation is sometimes the only way to get people to stop treating your boundaries as optional. Ava scheduled court dates, set up secure communication lines with HR, and instructed me on what to do if my parent showed up at the office and is here to Paris again. Call Security Global or Badias, call the police, don't speak unless a lawyer is present. She also helped me send the initial notices to financial institutions, certified letters, copies of deeds, and formal requests to redesignate signatories. The bureaucratic language was dry, but the purpose was sharp. Separation would be legal, not performative. I did not sleep well that week. My mind kept flipping between spreadsheets and the memory of the wedding album at Aunt Margot's. But each time I felt the old, familiar tug of guilt, as if I was being mean by making boundaries. I looked at the receipts. The truth is a stubborn kind of arithmetic. You can scrub it. You can pretend it's not there, but it adds up. By the time we filed the restraining order motion and had all the bank forms in motion, I felt like someone who had stopped lending her name to people who'd been spending it like a tab. It wasn't triumphant. It was tidy and necessary. Legal separation doesn't erase the past, but it makes future transactions honest. And for the first time since the album, that felt like enough. The phone rang just after lunch. I was at my kitchen table surrounded by nothing glamorous: a laptop with too many tabs, a mug that said "World's Okayest Sibling," and a stack of stamped envelopes waiting for certified letters. Caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I almost sent it to voicemail out of muscle memory. Then something in me, practical as a paperclip, decided to answer. "Hello?" "Maya," she said, and for a second I just listened to the name land. It was Noah's wife, the woman from the album, the woman who had been smiling in photos where I was deliberately not invited. Her voice was small in a way that made honesty sound like a risk. "It's Maya, I need to tell you something." I sat down properly. The polite part of my brain wanted to prepare for honeyed apologies or triangulated explanations. The rest of me kept a pen ready. "You don't have to," she started, then swallowed the rest like a bad bite. "I need to apologize. I'm sorry about the wedding. Noah told me you said you didn't want to help, that you refused. He made it sound like you wanted to cause a scene." "So he lied," I said. The sentence was not surprised. It was simply putting things in the right column. "He lied," Maya agreed. "I asked him for texts. I asked him for what happened. He evaded. I pressed until he gave me a version that fit the story he wanted. That you were the problem, so we could have the peaceful wedding he wanted. I feel complicit. And I'm sorry." There it was. The admission without gesture. I could have laughed at the timing. I could have cataloged her guilt and turned it into another neat file. Instead, I listened, because it felt like the right, rare thing to hear in a family where people preferred rehearsed grief to messy truth. "He said you refused to help because he thought it'd be easier," she continued. He said you made scenes at events. None of it matched what I've seen of you in snippets. You showing up at community cleanups, hiring carpenters, sending flowers for Aunt Margot's birthday. It didn't add up. The more I watched Noah, the more it looked like he was doing exactly what his father did, shaping things to his advantage, sidelining anyone who inconvenienced that plan. Her words landed differently because she said the name of the pattern. Her father's abusive tendencies. Hearing that, without theatricality, felt like a strange form of validation. Not because I wanted to be right about Noah's behavior, but because patterns have names, and names make things stop feeling like personal failings and start feeling like what they are, choices people make. I'm not trying to fix things for you, Maya said quickly, as if she'd already anticipated the polite armor I'd be putting on. I don't know what you want from me. I just wanted to tell the truth as I now understand it. Noah made decisions without you. He misrepresented you. I'm sorry I let it happen. And I recognize the same behavior in my dad. That's messy for me. I'm trying to figure out what I will and won't tolerate. There it was, an awkward, tentative solidarity that didn't ask for forgiveness. She wasn't begging, she was confessing. That made it easier to take in. What do you want me to do with that? I asked, because my life at that moment involved a lot of triage and fewer dramatic reconciliations. Nothing, she said. If you want to talk, I'll answer questions. If you want nothing to do with me, I'll respect that. If you want evidence, texts, emails, I can show them. You deserve the truth, even if it's late. She offered something tangible. Not a plea, but a paper trail and an apology. It was more than most of them had the courage to give. I told her I appreciated it and that I was focused on making my life coherent. That was true. I also said I didn't want her to feel alone in seeing the pattern. Recognizing it is the hardest part, I told her. Doing something about it is the other, and it's slower. We hung up with no promises, no plans, no manufactured closure. Just two adults who'd finally spoken and, in speaking, moved a few things from myth into the light where they could be assessed honestly. It didn't feel tidy. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a small, necessary step toward keeping the people who harmed me accountable, and the ones trying to make different choices honest. Aunt Margot showed up on a Tuesday like a character in a mystery who knows the map and finally decides not to hide it. She was carrying an old leather briefcase that looked like it had been on a plane in 1987 and had opinions about humidity. Her hands trembled just enough that I knew the thing she was delivering had cost her something. I kept copies, she said, before I could do anything but usher her in. Thought you ought to see them. Her voice had a thread of apology woven into it that I hadn't heard before. Or maybe I had, and I'd been too angry to notice. She opened the briefcase like a confession and laid out a small fortune of paper and printouts, email chains, screenshots of text messages, scanned bank records. The emails were from my mother, Linda, sometimes curt and transactional, sometimes soft and calculating. Subject lines read like small, private memos. Need for the doc. Tara will understand. Don't make this about money. The texts were worse because they read like stage directions. Tell Noah she refused so we can keep it peaceful. One message said, time-stamped 2 days before the wedding. Another thread showed Linda coordinating with Aunt Margot herself about wording for the invitations. Not an accident, but choreography. Then there were the financial records. Bank transfers with memo lines in my mother's handwriting, family help, roof, harbor fix. Underneath each was a second column, a transfer back, a partial reimbursement, a payment to a credit card with my name co-signed. The papers stitched a seam through years. Small favors that accumulated into dependency, polite language that functioned as a leash. Aunt Margot watched me as I flipped pages. Her face was a landscape of relief and relief's cousin, fear. I should have said something sooner, she whispered. I was tired of being in the middle. I thought if I kept quiet it would be kinder. I see now it was cowardice. There's a strange quiet that comes when a narrative you suspected becomes the one you can prove. I felt the air settle in my chest, not because I was suddenly triumphant, but because the fog had a name. The briefcase wasn't just ammunition. It was permission to stop guessing. I photographed everything on my phone, labeled the files, and slid copies into a folder for Ava. These weren't only receipts of theft disguised as family support. They were evidence that the pattern wasn't random indulgence, but intentional manipulation from the people who were supposed to be anchored to me. The texts where my mother instructed others to lie about me entered the same registry as the bank transfers where I'd quietly kept things afloat. Aunt Margot stayed long enough to drink the tea I made like a penitent and left with an awkward little smile that tried to be brave. I walked the briefcase to Ava's office that afternoon, feeling a 30-pound weight in my hands and a strange, clean exhaustion in my bones. Evidence, as it turns out, is both a tool and a lament. It proves the story and forces you to admit how long you held the pieces together alone. The hearing was quieter than I expected. Courthouse air that smells like disinfectant and resignation, people in suits who never laugh at anything not listed on a docket. I sat in the back with Ava, my files stacked like an altar, and watched the judge read through the timeline like someone verifying the facts of a slow-moving accident. When she looked up, she said 3 sentences I'd been rehearsing in my head, but never allowed myself to actually want. The court granted a restraining order. My parents were ordered to stay at least 500 feet from my workplace and my residence. Violation would be a criminal contempt. It felt strange to be relieved by a line on paper, but that's the thing about boundaries given weight. They stop being polite suggestions and start being laws. Walking out of the courtroom felt like stepping through a narrow door into winter air. For the first few days, I was hypervigilant, checking locks, asking Lori to flag visitors, letting HR know the order had teeth now. But the legal victory started doing quiet social work for me, too. People who had been on the fence, cousins, an uncle who used to call on Sundays, neighbors who'd borrowed tools for years, began to rearrange themselves. It wasn't all tidy. There were phone calls that tapered off into non-responses. Church ladies who used to bring casseroles sent cards that said, "Thinking of you," with less frequency. My voicemail filled with stilted sympathies that didn't translate into presence. It was grief, oddly shaped. People distancing themselves from my parents and by osmosis, from me. Some of that stung because it felt like exile by association. Some of it felt like relief because distance has a cruelty that's sometimes also a mercy. Aunt Margot, the one who'd brought the briefcase, called and said she couldn't come to any family dinners for the foreseeable future. "I'm not ready," she said, "and I don't want to be the bridge that burns you both." Her voice was weary, not defensive. That distance felt honest. It was a folding in on herself rather than a weapon. Other relatives, though, took the easier route, a polite, performative retreat that read like spectators clearing the stands when the theater's argument got too loud. Meanwhile, the strain crept into Noah and Maya's life in practical, dull ways. The refinance and reassignment of loans, the ones I'd helped clear, didn't disappear. They resettled. Banks asked for new papers, new guarantors, new money. Noah, who'd relied on the convenient narrative that I'd always pick up everyone's slack, suddenly had bills with his name clearly on them. Maya, who'd apologized on the phone and then tried to build a life that didn't revolve around other people's scripts, found the spreadsheets she'd been handed were more tangled than he'd let on. The cracks were small at first: a missed payment, a terse text, an argument about a spreadsheet at midnight. I'd occasionally hear through the grapevine, a cousin's offhand comment, a barista who knew Noah, that they'd been fighting about money, about expectations, about who they were supposed to be to each other and to their families. Money exhaustion is its own kind of truth serum. It makes people say what they actually feel when the safety net is gone. I didn't enjoy watching them fall apart. That's not what any of this was about. But patterns have consequences. When people build a life on other people's unpaid labor, the structure looks sturdy until the foundation is legally reassigned. Then it creaks. The pastor, the familiar, comfortable voice who'd preached about sacrifice and patience, started to call other family members, consoling in one breath and advising boundaries in another. Some folks took that as a cue to distance themselves from my parents. Others doubled down on loyalty, interpreting my actions as theatrical and uncharitable. It was messy, and like most messy things, it revealed the shape of who people were when things weren't convenient. By the end of those weeks, my life felt quieter. My phone rang less with family noise and more with people who were actually present. Aunt Margot's tentative check-ins, Maya with the occasional blunt text about court dates and repairs, Ava reminding me to breathe. The silence from the rest of the clan sometimes felt vast enough to echo. Other times, it felt like a clearing. A space finally given to me that hadn't been granted as a courtesy, but earned by insisting on a boundary. The order had done what it needed to do. It bought me physical distance and a legal buffer. Socially, it redistributed the cost of sticking around. Some branches of the family bent away. A few held. The marriage that once hid behind a smiling album began to reveal the cost of the choices it had been built on. And as the dust settled, I found that the next confrontation, if there was to be one, might not be just about dates and deeds. It would be about the way we accounted for each other's humanity. They came to my office on a wet Thursday, the kind of day the city looks like it's trying to wash its sins off. My assistant Lori called me from downstairs in that low, practical voice that meant some people are here and they are not leaving. When I pushed open the glass door, there they were, Greg and Linda, both too tidy, as if guilt had been ironed into their collars, and Pastor Samuel lingering like a man who'd been deputized to soften edges. Pastor Samuel wanted to come talk, my father said before any breath could be wasted on hello. His voice was a practiced hope, the kind people use when they want to coax forgiveness into existence without changing behavior. Pastor Samuel smiled with the softness of someone paid to make people feel seen. "Tara," he said, "we thought it best to offer a way forward. Reconciliation is possible. The church can help." There's a particular stillness that arrives when people present a script instead of an apology. I could have sat down and let the scene unfold. Baskets of platitudes, offers to work on things, the slow, rehearsed pivot toward mutual misunderstanding. But I'd spent months turning my anger into documents, my hurt into legal boundaries. I'd learned that clarity beats theatrical contrition every time. "No," I said. The single word packed a lot. No to performances, no to negotiations that start with my erasure. No to being the family's soft landing pad. Don't. Save it. My father's face shifted like someone who'd been hoping for a different ending in the book he'd been reading. "Tara, we came to apologize. We." "Apologies are cheap here," I interrupted. "You sent me an invitation with the wrong date on purpose. You coordinated lies through Aunt Margot. You instructed other people to tell stories that made me the villain so you could have a peaceful wedding. And you've been living on money and favors I quietly supplied while pretending you'd sacrificed anything. That is not a misunderstanding. It's manipulation." Linda went pale as if she'd been asked to explain calculus on the spot. Pastor Samuel opened his mouth, the good shepherd about to recommend the same flock-friendly remedy he always does. Confession, prayer, softened hearts. "Pastor Samuel," I said, looking at him like someone checking the fit of a suit, "I respect your work, but I don't need mediation that puts the onus on me to be the bigger person. I need accountability. I need them to stop showing up where I live and work, stop putting my name on loans without consent, stop coordinating lies that erase my presence. I already have a court order for safety. That will stand. What I don't need is a sermon on forgiveness when the people asking for it won't change the behavior that makes it necessary." My father's hands clenched. "We were trying to spare you drama," he said, a taut little thing that wanted pity. You thought it'd be easier to make me the problem than to have honest conflict," I finished for him. "You didn't think to ask whether I wanted to be kept away. You decided. You treated me like a line item." Silence pressed the room into itself. Pastor Samuel's eyes flicked between us like a conciliatory referee, and for a heartbeat I could see the old dynamics. The way the family had always preferred stories where everyone kept their roles and no one asked for repair money in a way that looked costly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. It was heavier than I'd expected. The weight of years is odd that way. and I watched their faces try to anticipate what it contained. Greg's shoulders tightened like someone bracing for a storm he helped make. "I kept family photos," I said. Not because I wanted to punish you with nostalgia, but because I believed memory should belong to the person who remembers it. These are photos of birthdays, of the lake when we made it livable, of people who thought they could count on me to tidy up their lives. They're proof of what we had and what you chose to make of it. I set the envelope on the table and slid it toward my father. The gesture was ceremonial and small, the sort of thing that says, "I am done caring for your optics." "I'm releasing myself from the obligation of being your daughter," I said. It wasn't a line I'd rehearsed for drama. It was a legal, emotional, and ethical statement all at once. A release, not a renunciation of the past, but a refusal to be the family's unpaid labor any longer. You could see the words land like cold coins. My mother's face crumpled somewhere between confusion and wounded pride. My father's jaw worked like a man trying to count a debt he'd never intended to repay. Pastor Samuel's voice softened. "Forgiveness is a process, Tara. Maybe start with conversation." "Process," I echoed. "I don't need a process that begins with my erasure. If you want reconciliation, it has to be accompanied by concrete actions. Correcting the records, paying back misappropriated funds, staying away from my workplace without invitation, and acknowledging the texts and messages that coordinated the exclusion. Until those things happen, there can be no meeting in good faith." I said each item plainly, because plainness makes excuses harder to hide behind. My father's lips moved as if to bargain. My mother wanted to cry, but seemed to find scripts lacking tears. Pastor Samuel shifted, and for a moment I thought he might broker some middle ground that would let everyone keep their dignity, like it was a communal blanket. I stood, because the last stage of family argument is usually where they try to draw you back into the old orbit with sentimental gestures. I had no need of being orbit captured. "You taught me to fix things," I told them finally. Softer now, not pleading, but honest. "You taught me how to measure and shore up and keep a place from leaking. I fixed the dock because I loved this family once. That doesn't mean I owe you my life stability while you decide when to include me. I'm not the enemy. I'm someone who will no longer subsidize your choices." I walked them to the door. Pastor Samuel lingered for a second, his pastoral instincts wrestling with the legal and emotional reality I'd made clear. He patted my shoulder with that careful, public-hearted kindness and said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." "If I want you," I said, and meant it. Not a rebuke to the man, but a boundary about the role he'd chosen to play. He nodded, probably imagining the eventual reunion he'd preach about in sermons. I didn't stop him with theology. I offered him honesty instead. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was not barren, but full. It felt like the air after pruning. Raw at first, but giving the plant room to grow in new directions. I gathered the photos slowly, thumbed the corners, and instead of burning them or shredding them, I slid them back into the manila envelope and put it on my shelf. It was both concession and custody. I wasn't rejecting memory, only reclaiming ownership over what memories cost me. Walking back to my desk, I realized I felt a strange lightness. This wasn't victory over them. It was victory for myself. I'd named the ledger, closed the accounts of quiet favors, and told the people who treated me like a convenient resource that the resource wasn't available anymore. That's not cruelty. That's self-preservation dressed in neat, legal language. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the city looked like it had been scrubbed. The lake glinted in the distance, unchanged by the drama around its edges. I sat down, opened a fresh document, and began to write the list of things that would come next. Not a plan of revenge, but of repair. I had work to do. Finances to tidy, relationships to reconsider, a life to build where my presence wasn't transactional. For the first time since opening Aunt Margot's album, the idea of the Lakehouse no longer felt like a bill I was paying for other people. It felt, quietly, like a place that belonged to me. A year later, the Lakehouse didn't feel haunted anymore. The walls no longer whispered about family arguments or phone calls that went unanswered. They breathed like they'd finally exhaled. Morning light spilled across the water like something benevolent, and the air had that late summer scent, clean pine and warm stone. Tara sat on the porch with coffee and her dog, Miso, watching the ripples break against the dock she'd repaired herself. The world she'd built in those 12 months was quiet but full. Aunt Margot came up every few weekends, bringing flowers and stories that didn't end in disappointment. Jenna Morales, her lawyer-turned-friend, helped her start a small consulting firm specializing in protecting women from financial exploitation, a kind of poetic inversion of what she'd survived. And Thomas, the carpenter who'd helped restore the Lakehouse Foundation, had become something steady in her life. Not dramatic, not rescuing, just there. There was still the occasional pang, the strange ghost-like tug when she'd see a family gathered at the farmer's market or a wedding photo drifting through her social feed. But the difference was that now she didn't flinch from it. She'd learned the past wasn't something to scrub clean. It was something to shelve in its proper place, like old books that once taught you something painful and necessary. That morning, a letter arrived. Her father's handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, the same penmanship that used to sign her report cards. She didn't rush to open it. She set it on the table, finished her coffee, and listened to the gulls for a while. When she finally slit the envelope, the letter inside was short. He wrote that he had come to understand what she meant that day in her office, that he'd believed control was the same as love, that dependency was the same as closeness. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He admitted he didn't deserve it. He simply said he was sorry for making her strength feel like betrayal. Tara folded the letter once, neatly, and put it in a cedar box where she kept her grandmother's locket and a few postcards from Aunt Margot. She didn't cry. There was no need for ceremony, no soft piano music swelling in the background of her mind. The act of storing the letter wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. Some debts can't be repaid, only recorded and closed. Later, as dusk turned the lake copper and the trees black, Tara took a walk down the dock. The boards creaked beneath her feet, the same sound they'd made when she was a kid, though now it carried comfort instead of tension. She sat at the edge, dipping her fingers into the cool water, and for a moment she thought about how strange it was that peace and loneliness could coexist so easily, like two sides of the same quiet coin. But that's what healing really is, not forgetting the people who broke you, but living so fully that their power fades into background noise. Behind her, the Lakehouse glowed softly with warm light. In the reflection, it looked almost like a promise kept.